technical session number 2. We had very interesting presentations in the session number 1. I was just worried that post-lunch, some of you may go to sleep. But once you saw Sophie there and Sophia there, and you got scared about that part, that presentation made me to think about a movie called Planet of Apes. Right? It was a conflict between two species. So I'm just looking at a future period of time when there'll be a movie called Planet of Human. And it will be a fight between the human and the robots. And it will be interesting to see how the human civilization grows and how the robotic civilization will grow. Yeah, Terminator, yes, that movie that we have seen there. In fact, I read a book called The Future of Machines, Kajai's book. And in Future of Machines, that talks about how silicon chips and carbon chips are going to integrate together and work together. Then there will be no difference between human being and computers, and they will call them as humanoids. They'll be called as humanoids. So it will be interesting to watch the emotions among the humanoids and the relationships among the humanoids as we go forward. I just imaginatively think about a parallel civilization where you have the masters, the human being, and then you have the slaves, the robots. But Professor also talked about robots being able to reproduce robots. Not in the right reproductive sense of reproducing robots like human being, but if they can manufacture robots by themselves, that reminds me of the movie called Universal Soldier, if you have seen this movie, part 1, which can look at artificial intelligence and do that part. I take interest in technology and future. That's why I read a bit of that, not like Professor. So there'll be two civilizations, and one day there will be a rogue guy, either a rogue robot like Rajnikant, or Rajnikant is a film star in India. He makes such kind of movies. Or maybe a rogue human being or a scientist, maybe from Pakistan or somewhere. Pakistan is an interesting place where you get all these rogue people there. It's a rogue nation. So, but I don't know whether Pakistan will be there by that time or it will be called a different country, like something owned by China or someone. China is trying to take over Pakistan. Many times I have got few dreams in my life. One of the dream is to buy the Colonel Gaddafi Stadium in Lahore. So once Pakistan disintegrates, I would like to buy that stadium. Because India lost a couple of matches when I was growing up. So I want to take revenge on that. So how this conflict will happen? What I'm trying to say is that this session is more about the future. This session is about, yes, we have been able to look at inwardness in Professor Chatterjee's talk about interpreting the philosophy of life in the context of frictions and the war that we face as an individual between your real self and the ideal self. And then we talked about how the society is evolving, how things have to be long-term, how technology and human civilization conflict is coming into picture, and how we're going to redefine everything. If you remember the last part of our presentation, she talked about redefining everything. There's a question about redefinition of ethics, but she said, no, it is not about only ethics. It is about even redefinition of communication that you want to do that part. So I'm just wondering at some point of time, a human being will not be able to communicate with another human being without taking the help of the computers. And how helpless you will be at that point of time. Maybe they will drive us to a room and the robots will do the presentations on ethics and future and we'll be listening to that part. Sometimes when you imagine, they sound very scary for all of us. But this session is very futuristic, and we imagine or we think that they are going to give us some direction, some ideas to faculties and students, how the future should evolve, how should this conflict be resolved between business, which pursues profit goals, per se profit goals, and the law, which is supposed to control and show you the right kind of a path, and ethical norms, which gives you a responsive behavior. My interpretation of ethics is all about a responsive behavior that individuals can have, which comes out of responsive thinking practices. So this session has got Professor Laknath Jaisinghe, who is going to chair this session. And Professor Laknath Jaisinghe is two parts now, right? He's also from the university and also with our university. So he's the right bridge in between. And Manisha was sleeping. So Manisha is here. Manisha is going to give a talk also, her presentation on behalf of our school. And we have Professor who is going to talk about global supply chain and some ethical things which happens with the global supply chain. So sometimes deans also talk sense. Right? Because in the morning session I said dean's job is to only welcome and give board of thanks. But now we have dean who is going to really talk about some research and his viewpoint about the world. Professor Neeraj is on the way. That's what Professor Ravi told me. So anytime he may come, he is in Parliament. I don't know what he's doing in Parliament, but he's coming on the way. He can be here at any point of time. He'll bring a view from a corporate governance point of view because he's from ICA, Institute of Corporate Affairs. So this session should be a very interesting session from that point of view. Now I won't take much time because tea is over, lunch is over, everything is over. Now Professor Lakhna Jaisinghe to take over.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Dean Panda, for keeping us awake. So I thought, we're running behind time, so I'm going to be the bad cop Nazi timekeeper for this afternoon's session. So I do apologise to the speakers, and I do apologise to all of you as well, that we're going to have to cut short such stimulating discussions. No doubt on the bus back, we'll have a thought-provoking and interesting discussion all the way back up to Sonipat. So let me start by saying welcome officially, from my capacity at least, to my friends from across the ocean, my friends from Australia, from Sydney. Welcome, as I like to say, welcome to my friends from Sonipat. And as people who know me quite often, often say, I myself have travelled across from Sydney to Sonipat, and now we're travelling back again as well. My name is Lakhna Jaisinghe. To those that don't know me, I see many familiar faces from my classes last term and this term. I also see many unfamiliar faces, and perhaps I will see you all in the next coming term. I'm an associate professor in marketing here. I'm also Vice Dean of Research at JGBS. I also play a double role. I'm an Associate Director of the Centre for India-Australia Studies, and hence I'm sort of in this role here. At Macquarie, I was actually a faculty member for 2.5 years, so I was pretty much ingrained within the structures and systems and social life of the faculty. And I welcome you all to this afternoon's concluding session titled Imagining a Better World, right? And I hope we can sort of imagine that, not just in a sort of fantastical fantasy sort of space, but how can we actually do that? How can you do that? How can we do that at JGU? How can we do that in these collaborative links we might establish? And how can we do that? How can you do that when you go out into the workspace or into the research world? So as an entree to some of the discussions going on today, I want to sort of get us to pause and sort of think about the confluence of we are global, forces and discourses that have brought us here, brought me here, brought you here. The opening session saw some truly startling ideas pushed out by Professor Chatterjee, for example, Professor Briggs, Professor Kumar, and so on. And I just want to actually, for you to pause and think about some of the issues that were thrown at us and some of the challenges that Professor Chatterjee, for example, implored us to think about. We also saw the signing of an historic MOU between our school and your school, and between Sonipat and Sydney and back, as I quite often say. But I also want you to reflect on what occurred in session 2, right? Session 2, we had Professor Majumdar talk about sort of the tussle between shareholder and stakeholder concerns from a legal perspective in his realm. Then we had Professor Lung talk about fascinating issues, and I hope you do share your slides with us. And I certainly will be jumping on YouTube tonight and tomorrow. That's the world you will inhabit. That's the world you will certainly inhabit, and that could be your workspaces. What are some of those ethical domains around sociality, about employees, about you being a manager, about you being managed? As Professor Gupta said before, you might have various ethical challenges when your manager, your line manager comes to you and says, perhaps you work this way, and you go, well, I don't really feel like doing that. That's not the right thing. I've been in that situation many times. I've had to change company reports for global advertising agencies on the instruction of my line managers who wanted to produce good results for for their managers and above. So I want you to start thinking about these issues. They're not sort of issues to be discussed just in here. They're issues to be discussed at the canteen, at the pub, right? In the workspace, at lunchtime, and so on. What does it mean to be a human, ethical human being, a social being, not just as a colleague, but also as a practitioner, as a researcher, and so on. We are pushing for time, so I'm going to cut mine short. But before I do, I'm going to cut my introduction short. But before I do, I want to close with a provocation. And this is mainly for the students, I guess, but it's also for us. In the world that I said you, but I also mean me, will inhabit personally, professionally, and socially, right? One that is increasingly global, in terms of not just the finances and the technology movements that we have talked about, but also in terms of, for example, information flows, image flows, right? Ideological flows, flows of ideas, right? I want you to think about what sort of ethics do you apply? What sort of ethics do you apply in an everyday context, right? At the coalface of your work, of your studies, right? Of your research, of your reporting, of your presentation. What sort of ethics do you apply at the coalface, at an everyday level, mundane, banal, writing your research reports, that sort of thing? But it's not just at university. What sort of ethics do you apply next year, perhaps, as many of you go out into the workforce, right? And you are challenged. What sort of ethics do you apply in legal settings or intercultural settings as well? As you reach perhaps the end of your life or end of your working life, you will look back, or could you look back and say, well, yeah, that was a life decently led. That was a life where I actually did contribute something beneficial to global social and cultural change. So to help flesh out some of those issues, and some of the issues that talk about how to make the world a better place within particular contexts, let me introduce the two speakers, and I'll introduce the third as he joins us. We have first up Professor Manisha Mishra, as you no doubt will be aware comes from our school. Professor Mishra is the program director here at Program Director here at Jindal Global Business School. She's also an associate professor. She's also got deep insight around ethics, and I implore you to listen to her wise words. That will be followed up very briefly by Professor Stephen Brammer, who's Executive Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics, my former faculty at Macquarie University. And I'm just going to read out, for those not familiar with Professor Brammer, just some words from his bio. Professor Brammer has been appointed Executive Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics. He is an industrial economist by training and holds a Bachelor, Masters and PhD in Economics from the University of East Anglia. Prior to his appointment at Macquarie, he was Director of Faculty and Professor of Strategy at Birmingham Business School, based at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And before that, he held senior positions at the Universities of Bath and Warwick. He's a recognised leader in business ethics and corporate social responsibility, specialising in how organisations build and manage mutually rewarding relationships with and across a range of stakeholders. A former president of the International Association of Business and Society and an active member of the Academy of Management, where he has served as Secretary, Representative at Large and newsletter editor for the Social Issues in Management Division. He currently serves as an AE, Associate Editor at the British Journal of Management, and is a member of the editorial boards of Business and Society and Business Ethics Quarterly. We are indeed very privileged to hear his words. So without any further ado, I'll first go to Professor Manisha Mishra and then introduce Professor Brammer again. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Singh. Uh, uh, so I don't have a particular topic about, but I will just touch upon the academic side of business ethics and maybe how about teaching it in class. So I just want to start with I teach HR in Jindal Global Business School, and I would like to tell Professor Leong that we are the ones who do the barbaric acts of buying your time to make a living. So the HR professionals, and I teach how to make, I hope, I don't know, I teach them how to do HR, but I don't know how well they will do it there. But they will definitely buy your time and do that barbaric act. Uh, so I also teach one of the electives called Diversity and Inclusion Management, and I always want to ask people that how do you teach diversity and inclusion management in class? Similarly, how do you teach ethics in class? I mean, can you really teach ethics to students? Can you really actually do, and after they pass out or they give the exams of ethics, I mean, hopefully they don't teach in that exams, but we have examples of students teaching in the ethics exams also. So, and after they go through the diversity and inclusion management course, are they really going to build those kind of diverse organizations, or are they really sensitive enough to have that quality or skills to have, include diverse people in organizations, and how to make an inclusive organizations whenever they go out. So, so just to maybe it sounds like a classroom, but just to revise what we have learned about ethics till now. Ethics is a set of standards, values, norms, rules to live your life by. If we are in the business context, we are in the management school context. So business ethics is set as standards or rules of how organizations work. Now, Professor Arya talked about long-termism, and so ethics is, there is always this debate between short-termism versus long-termism. So you make kind of certain decisions, and that is very rampant in organizations and corporations. Why? Because what are organizations? Organizations are entities of people who are, working towards a certain goal, and that goal primarily is profit. So there's always this conflict, this war between whether should I focus on right now in the short-term future, that I do certain things, I bribe certain officials, I lobby for certain laws, and I will get certain benefits for my organizations or for my corporation and for my industry. Or should I look in terms of long-termism, that I focus on the future? And as Professor Arya mentioned, that you talk about intergeneration versus intragenerational benefits, right? So in terms of climate change, in terms of sustainability studies, we all focus on, or the focus is on whether how do you leave the world behind for your future generations, right? And then there is this debate between, or this conflict between, or this option between whether what am I focusing on, whether I'm focusing on shareholders or stakeholders. So whether again I am focusing on the economic part of it, or the people who have invested in my company, or whether I include everyone inside and outside my organization, and I look at what are the effects that my decisions are having on the world around me. So stakeholder versus shareholders. And they're different. So if you go into the academic parts of it, that how business ethics or the study of business ethics in classrooms and in the academic world came to, so there are a lot of words, a lot of terms which are used. So obviously one is business ethics. The other term that is used is economic ethics. What, like, as being taught as a course. Then there is CSR, corporate social responsibility, corporate governance, and obviously corporate governance laws, issues, all these things are. So there are different things which are focused on in the umbrella of ethics or business ethics. Now obviously we, as the discussion earlier has also happened, that why is, and as Professor Chatterjee had mentioned, that is business ethics a separate, or is a part of, or is business ethics something different, or is it a part of ethics or personal ethics which has to be applied in organizations also? So, but like, I mean, talking about reality and what is happening in the academic world and what is happening in management schools, the subject or the discipline is taught under the name of business ethics, right? So So ethics is a set of standards. Ethics, there are continuous ongoing debates in ethics was in terms of time, in terms of which people to focus on, and in terms of, obviously in terms of nomenclature. Now, ethics and anything in management we know is based or has to be guided by the context. So ethical values, ethical norms, ethical standards are always have to be based or are inherently based. There is nothing, nobody says that this is what is supposed to be done. But what happens is it is generally in the context of the country you are in, right? So the culture of the country, the religion of the country, the societal norms of the country definitely have a major impact on what is the ethics of the country or what are the ethics that people live by, right? So the cultural context of, let's say, if we compare, and I'm using a very general term, let's say the East versus West, right? So we say that these are the certain cultural characteristics of East and these are the certain cultural characteristics of West, and these cultural characteristics affect the ethical norms and ethical values inside the organization, right? So we say that the Western countries or the Western organizations or the Western culture is individualistic, and the Eastern cultures or Eastern organizations, the Eastern norms and values are collectivist. So we focus more on, we meaning, considering we are in India and we are in the east side of the hemisphere, so we focus more on family, we focus more on the village, on our society, and we kind of stand behind society, stand behind our family, or let's say we depress or suppress our desires or needs. That is what was said. I will come to the situation what we are facing now. So we were supposed to, or we were supposed to suppress our needs, desires, and our successes for the family. So if the family, there was this tendency of not moving out of your hometowns, not moving out of your villages, and things like that, right? So this inherently, or this somewhere is still in our DNA, this holism, that we focus more on family, we focus more on cultural ties, on familiar ties. We think that work is to just live by, it is not the whole purpose of our life. We focus on different other things also. And the Western culture, if I were to generalize it, was more of individualistic. You celebrated individual success, you celebrated individual achievements. People wanted to celebrate heroes, right? So these were the two kind of main cultures. 2 minutes? Okay. Sorry. So these were the two kinds of, and I thought I had less than 10 minutes of material with me. Okay. So I forgot I was a teacher, I can speak a lot. So these two kind of cultures are there, and when the industry started growing in India and when the Western multinationals started coming in India, this is the clash we are seeing, right? So this is a clash that this kind of cultural ethical norms, which is very individualistic or standardizes, clashing with the cultures or the collective cultures of India. And now we see that the ethical norms and the ethical standards in India are quite different from the apparent culture or the inherent culture we had. So people have become individualistic, people want to achieve more, they want to earn more, they want to live a better life. And we have always seen and we have always lamented about the ethical norms being very low and very bad and very scarce in the political class, in the bureaucratic class. But now those kind of unethical standards have also come into the private sector, also have come into the educated people, have come in professionals, managers, MBAs, who are now bribing people, who are now bribing politicians, who are cutting corners. So this has come into the private educated class. And why has this happened? Because this kind of cultural clash has, and this kind of, establishing the norm or copying the norm or looking up to the West or looking up to the Western standards as being the only standards that are there, and you want to kind of assimilate yourself in the working standards of the McKinseys or the ENYs and the Deloittes and the KPMGs, right? And so this clash and this ethical clash has made the study of business ethics obviously important. And when did business ethics come to the academic world in India? It came around the 1990s. In 1970s, it was there. It started coming into the classrooms in the West. In 1990s, after the Bombay Stock Exchange scandals and things like that, it started coming in the realm of academic and in classrooms in India. And one of the few pioneer institutions were XLRI, were IIM Calcutta, where IIM Calcutta has a Center of Human Values, which does a lot of good work in this place. And there are two things, I'll just take one more minute. So there are two ways of teaching. I mean, that is what the beginners and the people who followed later say that. So there are the two ways that people are teaching business ethics in class. One is through cases. One is through just focusing on the practical example and focusing on debates and discussions. So I don't want to give you the right answer. I want you to figure out the right answer in class. And the other is that no, I want you to see that what is right, what is wrong, and these are the moral principles and these are the moral values, and this is how things are supposed to be done, right? So there is this debate again. So how to teach business ethics in class, and these are the two streams. And I mean, different schools are following. So XLRI and TAPME and Jamnabai school follows the case study method. On the other hand, IIM Calcutta and the Center for Human Values follows this, that no, we'll tell you what is right and wrong, and then you figure out how to go about it. And so just to end, just to highlight two things in the cultural context of India. Obviously, we heard the stories from Mahabharata from Dr. Chatterjee in the morning. So there is Krishna, and he has given given the gyan of, the knowledge of Gita to Arjun. But Krishna was also a very intelligent strategist, right? So if you read the Mahabharata, there are many examples where what he asked the other people to win the war are on very thin line of ethics, right? So on the one hand, he says that he will forgive. There is one character in Mahabharata called Shishupal, and he says that I will forget his 100 sins, right? I will forgive him, pardon him for his 100 sins. On the other hand, he asks Yudhishthir, who's one of the heroes, the elder brother of Pandavas, to lie, because Yudhishthir is known for the Lord of Dharma, he can never lie. But he asked Yudhishthir to lie to get Dronacharya killed, right? So even Krishna, to win the war, is asking, now that's the debate, right? Whether those were unethical things or whether in the means to win a war, everything is ethical, right? Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll just get my slides up. But as I'm doing that, I'll say this. Deans don't normally get to do intellectual activity, so it's kind of, we get to do dealing with naughty boys and girls who don't like their promotion outcomes and various other bits of fun in the context of our huge business faculties. So it's a real pleasure to join what I think has been a really rich intellectual discourse around ethics in business, dilemmas that are faced in the contemporary business world, and how, pragmatically speaking, we as current or future business practitioners might make the world a better place through various aspects of our conduct. I'm a pragmatist, I'm not a philosopher, right? At a fundamental level. My work in my life as a practitioner and as a researcher has been about how ethics and issues of responsibility and sustainability are manifest in various areas of business practice, and how fundamentally organizations might organize themselves, manage themselves more effectively in order to satisfy the needs of multiple stakeholders. I'm going to say a little bit, core of what I'll talk about today is actually a study from India. I never thought I'd be presenting my Indian study in India, but it's a study of the realities of global supply chains at its heart, and it's with a colleague called Vivek Sundararajan, who's from the University of Birmingham, who's a fantastic guy who does primary research down in Tirupur in the textile supply chains, and it's fascinating work, I think. So I'll share some of that with you, and I'll also say a little bit about myself and what I do. So fundamentally, and I've got you can look me up on Google Scholar and you can see the various sorts of things that I've been working on. My career's been about, as I say, examining aspects of responsible business practice in a range of contexts. I've done work in human resource management, and that's work about employees and responses and commitment to organizations and how ethics and responsibility and authenticity and leadership and so on play into those sorts of contexts. I've done work about supply chains, how firms make things like sustainability work over global reaches and uncertain control spans. I do work about reputation, I do work in finance about socially responsible investors, and in accounting about disclosure issues in relation to corporate responsibility and sustainability. So I've traipsed far and wide in terms of academic disciplines, but the core of what I've done has always been concerned with matters of ethics or responsibility or sustainability as they are manifest in business practice. And I like to get involved in particular functions of business, if you like, because for me that's where you see ethics or sustainability in action. Right? It's not kind of, you can have a high-level strategy, and we all have a high-level strategy, but really it's where the rubber hits the road. How does a particular organization, in the context of managing its people or its brand or its global operations or its sourcing, how does it manage to deliver outcomes that are fair and equitable and reasonable and for society? And that's a sort of concern that I've had over a number of years. Let's face some realities. Right. Operations management, supply chain management over the last 15 or 20 years has really undergone a revolution to as markets have globalized, as manufacturing has shifted its locus, first to China and India, then throughout other countries in South Asia, and it will no doubt migrate into Africa before too long, and so on. Right. So, as that's happened in industry, that means that most organisations, most Western brand holder organisations, most top-tier buying organisations don't make anything anymore. Right? What they are is a sort of nexus of contracts whereby they own the primary design work, and then other organisations around the world actually do all the making and shipping to market and so on. That's raised a lot of questions about how, and we were just hearing, I think, a really interesting conversation around different cultures, different laws, different ethical and moral frames around the world. What that's confronted in particular Western society, but it's not exclusively a Western societal phenomenon too, is how those differences in laws, in norms, in other aspects of the institutional context play in terms of how organisations navigate those in ways either to exploit, for example, weak regulatory standards or low labour costs, versus how they give back to and embrace and support development in local contexts. The reality of global supply chains, I mean, it's not all a bad story because there's a lot of wealth and a lot of economic progress that's been made through global supply chains, but the reality is that organisations have found them very difficult to manage. Right? And the core is if you look at most Western organisations, big global Fortune 500 kind of companies, what they'll say is they're absolutely committed to a sustainable supply chain, that they're committed to good labour practices, that they're committed to non-pollution, that they're committed to respect for local cultures and so on and so forth. When you dig about a bit, what you discover is that organisations fall off that high moral obligation very often. And so there's a question, I think, a kind of puzzle at the heart of thinking about global sustainable supply chains. We know that firms say they want to do it, but we know that they also very frequently fail in delivering that. And so at the heart of the work that Vivek and I are doing together is really a kind of, how do we resolve that puzzle? Firms say they want a sustainable supply chain, but they don't appear very often to have one. Why is that? I think there's 2 or 3 different ways to go on this. Right. First way to go is to say, look, firms are liars. Right. At its basic truth, they don't want sustainable supply chains. What they really want is to make as much money as possible. The whole sustainability thing is a bit of a kind of weird, masking the reality of what the large corporates really want. It's a bit of brand building, a little bit of legitimacy, a sop to the bleeding heart liberals of the world, but fundamentally they're at it for the money, and there is no pretense that they really want a sustainable supply chain. I don't believe that, broadly speaking. I think that most organisations are sincere in a will to try and have good standards of various kinds in their supply chain. So I don't think, if you like, the kind of the darkest wicked witch of the West kind of scenario is the real answer. Second kind of story would be to say, look, firms are interested in sustainability, but ultimately sustainability doesn't win out in a context where other things matter. Right? So speed to market, quality, cost for the consumer, and so on. These are all other things that might matter. Sustainability is one of a number of priorities, but fundamentally not one that ultimately is high enough of a priority, often enough for firms to actually deliver that. So firms design their own processes. These are so complex, and rules and regulations that supply chains are kind of confused about what firms really want, and things like cost and speed to market overcome. And we've called that here buyer-derailed unsustainability. Right? The buying organisation and its confused priorities lead to problems. Second candidate explanation is really one of firm is clear about what it wants, but what it's not clear about is how that supply chain is fundamentally going to deliver a sustainable operation. Right? That suppliers who often lack the time, capability, and resources to meet those needs find it very challenging to meet the requirements of Western buying organisations, and because of that, there's a sort of supplier base that undermines attempts to deliver sustainability. And just to kind of cut to the chase, that's the right answer we find in our study. What we do in this work is to go and talk to very small suppliers, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th tier suppliers in garment manufacturing value chains in southern India, right? So this is about going and talking to people who are, you know, if Marks and Spencer or Gap is up here, you know, they're the supplier of those organisations. So right in the kind of bottom of the multi-tier here. And what we try and do is we try and understand how those suppliers think about and respond to pressure from Western multinationals to deliver. In particular, we focus on labour standards and various aspects of labour. You won't be able to read this from where you are, but you'll have to accept from me the following story. Now, the story we uncover when you look at narratives from these suppliers around how they respond to pressure is essentially that suppliers want to meet buyers' demands. Of course they do. They want to sustain in business. They want to get a good reputation with their suppliers, so they win more contracts and so on and so forth. But they have a very socially oriented relationship with that buyer, such that the central question that a supplying organisation asks is, does this buying organisation respect and understand me? Are they sympathetic to the conditions that I inhabit? Do they care for me in some fundamental sense as an organisation? Right. If the answer to that is yes, then the organisation, the supplier, will communicate clearly with the buying organisation, and there'll be an attempt to achieve some sort of reconciliation and recognition of the challenges, and often the buying organisation will participate in training or other resources that will help that organisation to meet its needs. If, on the other hand, the answer to that, and this is often the case we find, is no, this buying organisation just wants the stuff that we are giving them, then what happens is a kind of psychological switch gets flicked in the supplier's minds. And instead of trying to comply and doing their best with the needs and demands of those Western buying organisations, what happens is that the supplying organisation hides all the bad practices, systematically misreports data, and leads the Western buying organisation into a situation where they cannot be certain at all about compliance with standards of any kind in that supply chain. So part of what we go on to say, after, other than developing this model, is to say, look, the big problem here is that Western buyers are not sympathetic to or sufficiently understanding of the contextual conditions in which supplying organisations find themselves. If they're not, what that leads to is a set of behaviours on their part that simply undermines their capacity to actually deliver a sustainable supply chain. So this is a story fundamentally of context mattering, of buying organisations being thoughtless of what supplying organisations are capable of, and ultimately that undermining their ability to manage a value chain that is fully sustainable. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you for those insights, Professor Brahma. Let me first introduce Professor Neeraj Gupta, our third and final speaker for today. He's an associate professor and head of the School of Corporate Governance and Public Policy at the Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, New Delhi. He has more than 20 years of research, teaching and consulting experience and has an MBA in brand management with an PhD in brand management, with an MBA, MCOM, and postgrad diploma in financial management, and is an FDP from IIM Ahmedabad. He's a visiting ICSSR visiting research fellow and has been a visiting professor to many European universities and research institutions, and has performed as a consultant to the Ministry of MSME for their Entrepreneurial Capacity Development Program and CDNCD-PD, Ministry of Textiles for their Cluster Development Programs. I present to you and welcome Professor Neeraj Gupta. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jayasinghe, Professor Stephen, Professor Mishra, my dear friend, Professor Panda, Professor Agarwal, other colleagues of teaching fraternity, the students and participants. I'm extremely sorry at the outset for joining late because of some last-minute challenge I had to meet. In fact, I communicated to Professor Agarwal that I may not be able to make it out because Parliamentary Committee was asking for some feed for a meeting scheduled at 5:30, and I had to give that. But somehow I could meet because as Professor Stephen was talking about the desire and will to develop sustainable supply chains. So it is the will which prepares you for coming out with challenges and beating the deadlines. So this is how most of us are doing anyway. I don't know how much I have to speak on this topic. To be very honest, I have not prepared formally. But on the way, I was thinking what probably I can give as a value to you I'm thankful to Professor Panda for inviting me. It's a very interesting topic which has been selected: business, law and ethics, conflict or coherence. I'll not share any piece of my research on any of the topics in such a short time, but just some thoughts on the main theme which I want to share. Any ecosystem has three important components which we all know: individual, institution, and systems. And I feel it is not a topic of business, law, and ethics. It is a topic which talks about the coherence of the institution of individuals, the institution of institutions, and the institution of systems. It basically talks about the interplay, interdependency, exchange, and impact creation of these three components. Another thing which I would like to float here, because probably I'll be switching between two sets. First set I have already given you, individual, institution, and systems. The another set which is very important for any ecosystem, which in a very super specialized manner Professor Stephen was indicating in terms of developing sustainable supply chains, because that has enough interplay of the role of government for infusing the element of ethics, enough challenges in front of the business organization as far as their willingness, desire is concerned, or capacity is concerned, enough inputs in terms of the regulatory frameworks and the challenges which are always dynamic and keep on revising. So I'm giving you another set which is, I feel, very contextual for you. Is there are three things which these three institutions always talk about. The first thing is the governance. Second aspect is conformance. And third aspect is performance. Either you take up any of these institutions independently or a case together, you will find there is always a challenge of governance, there is always a challenge of conformance, means compliance, complying with the norms, complying with the ethical framework which the organization has, the tone which has been set at the top by the chairman and the board. And third is the performance, because you still need to be very competitive. So basically, it is these interplay of these three things, the governance, conformance, and performance, which always delivers a new permutation and combination of resources and challenges. Of course, the deadlines and the timelines, which poses a question of arriving at a decision for addressing them in the best possible way. Sometimes the two blocks matches as it is, and there is good governance, there is good conformance, and there is good performance. But wherever we fail, either because of the resource issue or because of the challenge issue that may involve the timelines or willingness aspect also, definitely there is a failure either in terms of performance, and that's how the business rankings keep on changing in Fortune 500. That creates a challenge on conformance, and that's why big companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers are debarred for two years from getting engaged with the auditing assignments. And that's basically creates another challenge of governance, where we see the top leadership of Volkswagen resigning and taking responsibilities of not meeting out the emission norms and all such things. So it's a basic interplay. Today's topic is it gave me enough food for thought and some new directions to thought about. I don't want to talk about corporate governance per se. It's rather broader. And if I connect them together, you will find very interesting connect. And that connect is the interdependency and impact of public systems with the private systems. Because when we talk of law, that involves public system, the regulatory framework within which we have to operate. The regulations, either it is with reference to the formation of companies or it is with reference to the regulation and conduct of the behavior or business of the companies, that's very, very important. And the private systems, because it's not only the government which is the regulator, it is not only the law which is the regulator. Business regulates what? Business regulates resources. Human resource comes within that. And you find the connect with the ethics part. Ma'am was talking about issues which are issues of ethics or unethical behavior, persistent in the subconscious of the individuals, and that's how we perceive and deliver. So, point is, everybody is a regulator. Business is a regulator of resources, human resources, manpower. Business is a regulator of wealth. Government, public systems, laws are regulator of systems. I'll take two allowed?
Yes.
And ethics, the underlying principle. So we need to be very, very clear in thought. This is how I have tried to weave it. So we need to find out where lies the conflict. I was at World Bank's conference and met Professor Colin Mayer. Many of you might be knowing him. He was the dean of SAD School of Business. So he gifted me his book, which made me read it way back to India during the flight itself. Why do corporations fail? And I'll just quote one interesting point. He said, it is a tussle between value and values. Value is the balance sheet, your net worth. Values is the ethics, your governance aspect. Values is not always corporate social responsibility or social responsibility. Values is much bigger than that. What governance model do you choose? And that's basically the reason. If you look at the geopolitical scenario and the global business ecosystem, you will find there are corporate houses who do not feel like dealing with some specific corporate houses because of this value framework. Because they understand that they are governed in a different fashion with a different mindset, and that doesn't have synchronization with our value system. So we don't deal with them. We look for a matching partner. So value and values is a bigger tussle. So dear students, I feel you need to concentrate on this issue, how to create a fine balance between these two. Then only you will be able to conclude. In 10 minutes, I cannot conclude for you. Is it a conflict or coherence? Second thing, which will be my last word, Professor Jaisinghe. Responsibility and responsiveness. This is what he has also told. I need to feel responsible. The corporates need to feel responsible. Simultaneously, government should also feel responsible. And that's how the governance systems needs to be weaved in. Our government is trying to weave in a kind of system so that even the voice of a common man could be connected with the government, so that it is always not a one-way traffic. It is a two-way traffic. MyGov application, which is unique in its way. We may find traces in different parts of the world, but when we look at India per se, we find that MyGov itself is the biggest communication device which has been created by the government to give chances to even a single individual to participate in the public systems and governance systems. So we need to look that we just want to remain confined within the responsibility boundaries, or we really want to be responsive. Because if we develop that, definitely the governance challenge, the compliance challenge, as well as the performance challenge will be met. We will stand complied with the laws, we will remain ethical, we will be good governed, and simultaneously we will be performing good as far as the markets and competitions are concerned. And this is what I'm concluding. This is what which has been endorsed by many thinkers, and that has to be taken care of. I'm not going to quote, otherwise it will take more time. The last message which goes is that we need to connect government. I give you an example of government. The businesses also need to connect with the stakeholders. If government connects with the stakeholders and business connects with its stakeholders, and the whole circuit gets closed, I'm sure the supply of energy, supply of power, supply of thoughts, ideation processes will emerge much stronger and faster, and definitely there will be better coherence. Of course, in bits and pieces, if you look at the present day environment, you will find there is a strong conflict in many of the areas. We are trying to fix those problems and coming out with a more coherent environment. Still, fine prints will create some fine challenges, which subsequently, because it's a dynamic process, so at no point of time the system can be 100% foolproof. And this is how we are developing and trying to reach to a stage of developed economy. So with these words, I again would like to congratulate JGU for inviting me and giving opportunity to interact with you. And further, I also want to congratulate both JGU and Macquarie University for the Memorandum of Understanding, for taking the agenda forward, which I am sure will go again beyond the boundaries with larger participation, bigger audience, bigger thought process, bigger deliberations. And I always would like to be a part of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our distinguished panel. Can I ask for a very hearty round of applause for Professor Mishra, Professor Brahma, and Professor Gupta. Thank you. We have very limited time, so I'm asking for perhaps just 2 or 3 minutes of questions. That is all. Those who know me know I'm a Nazi on time. Yes, go for it, Vijay.
So, good evening, sir. Myself, Vijay. I'm a final year student at Jindal Global Business School. My question is to the entire panel. I've been here for the 2 sessions, and we never talked about conflict as a necessity. I mean, we were all talking about coherent and how to be coherent, but we all know it's an abstract concept which can never be there. I mean, a completely coherent way of business, law, and ethics. We know even the ma'am talked about diversity between East and West. It's even more, when we come to India itself, we have a multitude of cultures over here. So aren't we looking, when we're talking about the future, isn't conflict a necessity, and isn't the coherence should be coming in the conflict which we are facing? We should be coherent in the framework which is created by the conflict. So I want to know the view from the panelists.
See, they are not mutually exclusive things, conflict and coherency. Even when you find a state of conflict, there is coherence within many conflicts. The same goes with the coherence aspect. Idea is conflict, of course, this is how, we deliberate, and probably you have picked up the idea of raising this question. Creative conflict and disagreement is always good. When a new person joins in a company, or say, there are enough stories. When the CEO of Uber was interviewed, you can Google it and you can find out this story. So can you imagine how many hours the interview went? It went 330 hours. In bits and pieces, over phone, dining table, early morning, late night. And why it was so long? Because the disagreement of the candidate who was interviewed was so large on many issues that it was discussed over a period of time. So question is, we want conflict. We want disagreements. We don't want yes men's or, compatible ideas always. Because if we do that, definitely the innovation, the intent of innovation will die in itself. So conflict is important, but a creative conflict, and there is nothing bad in it, to my mind. If my co-panelist would like to add something, that's good.
Okay, one further question and then we'll wrap it up. Siddharth?
My question is to Professor Brammer. You talked about the supply chain problem between the buyers and the sellers in India. Buyers and suppliers in India, and you said about the situation where if the buyers know the supplier a bit personally, they know of their personal problems. Like if the suppliers can come out truthfully to the buyers and they can come towards solution. If I understood correctly, I don't know if I understood that correctly. In economics, we call it sort of getting true preferences rather than stated preferences. You know, so it's just a comment, but I would like to know if it can be done through the help of game theoretical techniques in economics. If you can do some sort of mechanism design, change the way the behaviors interact between the buyers and the suppliers in India, so that the suppliers can trust you and come out with you with their true problems, and you can get engaged with those problems.
Yeah, I think you've understood our argument well, which is exactly that if a climate of trusting, mutual understanding can be developed, then that is a more constructive context within which supplying organisations that face challenges, limitations in capabilities or resources in meeting the kind of requirements that Western organisations might want to impose, if that is surfaced within the context of a trusting relationship, then there will often be situations where that can be resolved in a cooperative fashion, rather than a sort of latent conflict existing that then comes out only when there's a crisis or some sort of challenge that is disadvantageous to both parties. So that is very much the spirit of the argument and the evidence that we find. So yeah, as to whether game theoretic techniques are useful for that, yeah, I think they might be. Are cooperative outcomes possible, desirable in those sorts of contexts? Can you design policy frameworks, practice frameworks? I mean, there are some organisations that do this extremely well, and there are other organisations that persist in not doing it particularly well, and there are some sectors that have particular problems also. So, but I think what we're trying to encourage is more nuanced, contextually informed understanding of the limitations of a value chain to respond to pressure fundamentally. And if buying organisations were more thoughtful in some fairly basic respects, we think, then that might actually help much greater sustainability in supply chains.
I think we'll wrap it up for today. So can I please have one further round of thanks, and then we'll move to the presentation of the mementos. Thank you.